So I suppose my next question is about why did they flare up again in 422?
You would think that the death of Yazdegerd the First in 420 probably had something to do with it.
Yeah, and there does seem to be, I think the Christian element changes a bit as well, because towards the end of Yazdegerd's reign, it seems that there were some incidents where I think a couple of Zoroastrian temples were burnt or attacked. And Yazdegerd took action against the groups responsible, the Christian groups. So I think that starts to become a bit of an issue, even though, in fact, the church historian Socrates, who's a Roman, he actually claims that Yazdegerd never persecuted the Christians, that he was good, that it all started with his successor, Bahram V. But it does seem from other sources that actually right near the end of Yazdegerd's reign, things went sour. And of course, the moment you have a change in leadership and a brief civil war at that, which is what happened, I guess that always comes across as an opportunity. I mean, we have the Arabic tribes to consider as well, that there were some allegiances switched at this time. I think I don't remember which source, but one author mentions that an ancient author mentions that one of the Arabic chieftains basically was ordered not to let any Christian asylum seekers reach the West, not allow them to flee the Sasanian Empire. But not only did he allow them to pass, he then switched sides to the Romans. And so I think that becomes all a bit bound up in this as well. This would also make Armenia a source of tension again as well, because the Armenians are majority Christian.
It's something that I get a little confused as to where Bahram the Fifth and Artaxias the Fourth fit in next to each other, because this is not my specialty at all. But from what I was able to sort of glean when I was looking into it, it seems like Armenia is the flashpoint for sure, and it does seem to be that successive Persian rulers, Sassanid rulers, start taking a much sort of harder line in Armenia towards the Christians to possibly appease the Zoroastrian clergy and make points with the nobility, who presumably want to go looting and things like that and want land. So these things, that and the succession of Persian rulers at this point not being terribly stable, it does seem to be a semi-inevitable road.
Sure. Yeah, it also actually, in terms of just the different rulers that come into power in this period, Bahram himself is a notable one, because I do get the impression he's a hothead, that he's, there's so many Persian legends about this guy, and he almost comes across like the Richard the Lionheart of the Sasanians, that he's this adventurer. He's an adventurer. He loves hunting. He's almost like a hero from myth, but he's also a Sasanian king in the 5th century. And, you hear all these bizarre stories about him campaigning campaigning in the Horn of Africa and in Yemen and in India. And obviously how much of any of that reflects reality, I mean, who knows? But it does. These stories have to come from somewhere, and there's something about Bahram V that does suggest we're dealing with a sort of, if there's any truth to it, we have he comes across as a bit of an opportunist, a bit of a Pyrrhus type. The Arabic sources also discuss him marching north of the Oxus River into Central Asia as far as Tashkent and capturing Tashkent. Again, did he really get that far north? I guess we don't know, but it does make sense to me that this figure who, according to the Arabic accounts at least, which are based on Persian accounts, this is a person who, he's not the favored successor. He's kept in the periphery, on the edge of the Arabian desert during Yazdegerd's reign. And he forcibly takes power. I suppose I get, we're sort of bit of pop psychology here, but he seems like someone with something to prove. And
it seems a little bit like that, yeah.
Yeah.
I think I was just looking at my note there a second ago, and I did indeed conflate Artaxius the Fourth with Sharper the Fourth, because Sharper the Fourth got the Armenian throne, and Artaxius was supposed to, or something like that. My bad.
Oh, okay.
Because I believe it's in this period that the Arsacids of Armenia are removed.
Yes. I think Bahram gets rid of them. If I recall correctly, the Romans have already sort of got rid of them in their part of Armenia. But I think it is Bahram who eventually decides, let's just put it under direct Persian governorship, which tied in with what you were saying, Josh. It seems that there's a whole lot of opportunism going on in Armenia and throughout late antiquity, that you have these nobles looking to profit off of whatever religious or monarchical dispute there is. And at some point, it seems that the monarchy itself sort of becomes a bit meaningless. And it seems that the real power in Armenia are the lesser nobles, not the monarchy after a while.
So the war in 422 is quite short, sharp. The Romans do win it to an extent. And as far as I'm aware, it's more, as you say, about almost like a retaliation towards the treatment of the Christians during this interlude between Yastegerd I and Bahram. And then there's another long period of peace between the two for basically 20 years and until the 440s, when there's another short war between Persia and the Roman Empire. Both of these wars during Theodosius' reign are quite small, both in comparison to the 4th and 6th century wars.
Yeah, they both seem pretty, ultimately quite short wars, don't they? I mean,
yeah. I don't think either of them last more than a year.
My understanding is, in the case of the first war, Bahram tries to take the city of Theodosiopolis, which is built right near Armenia. And I guess, again, indicating that I suppose Armenia has something to do with all of this. The Roman sources are very triumphal, their language is very triumphalist about that the war in 421, 422. Although, except for Procopius, I'd say. I think Procopius is more, his take on it is more, everyone sort of went to war, and ultimately Anatolius, the Magister Militum in the east, basically was able to persuade Bahram to back down. Basically, they decide, okay, no more, we're not going to allow Arabic chieftains to switch sides anymore. Bahram's going to stop persecuting the Christians, and I think Bahram gets paid some money. I think.
Yeah. So having covered the 422 war in a little bit of detail, unfortunately that's all we have regarding these two wars, a little bit of detail. Let's talk about the 440 war between the Eastern Roman Empire and the Persian Empire. So, Josh, do you want to lead with this one?
Well, from what I know, and you learned gentlemen, feel free to tell me I'm an idiot and shut up and correct me. I will be happy to learn. But it seems like the first war didn't really achieve a great deal, except that payments started to be made into the Caucasus. And some people seem to think that this was an agreement by the Romans to pay off the Sassanids, and some people think that it's more complicated than that. But the upshot seems to be that whatever the Romans were paying for in the Caucasus, they stopped doing it. And when they stopped doing that, I should say Theodosius II stopped doing that, Yastegerd II declared war against the Romans, which is how we get the Second War. And the resolution of that war appears to be, again, somewhat opaque and some sort of mutual defense pact in the Caucasus or something like that.
It'd be nice for the sources to be a bit more clear and detailed on these matters, because I feel like this is a good occasion to just bring up the fact that, unfortunately, the thing about this whole topic is we don't have an Ammianus or a Procopius. This is a darker century for this topic, and because we just don't have that sort of detailed narrative source for what's going on.
These are
in the
indeed
East.
the Dark Ages, or
Yeah, that's it.
Or to use the politically correct term, ages of darkness. But you're quite right, Byron. And well, actually, I was looking into having writing all of the primary sources for the 5th century. It's a dark time in terms of coverage. I would contend, not necessarily because no one wrote about it, but because so much of what was written has been lost. So, in like the Western Roman Empire, you have various chronicles, like the Ravenna Annals. You have the various versions of Prosper's Chronicle, Datius. You also have a actual history by Frigeridus, which is lost. Probably was a much chunkier history, which Gregory of Tours ended up using. In the East, you have no end of histories being written. You've got Storgius, Socrates, Sozomen. Later in the century, you have Zacharias of Melitene, John Diocrenimus, Theodore the Lector, all writing church histories. And then you've got the secular histories of Olympiodorus, Malchus, Candidus. You also have Priscus.
Well, yeah, Priscus in particular, I think if we had a complete Priscus, we'd be much more well off.
Yeah.
Because Priscus was a proper, he's traveling around, he's seeing things, he's writing. We know he's writing about Roman-Persian relations as well as Roman-Hunnic relations, of course.
And lots of later authors used him too. Like Evagrius essentially uses Priscus as his main secular source. There's also Eustathius of Epiphania, who wrote a epitome of histories right at the end of the 5th century.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sure.
And then you've got the several Syriac histories. Like you've got I know it kind of falls out of this period slightly, but you've got Joshua the Stylite.
Good name.
Oh, indeed. And you've got the Chronicle of Zuchnin and Syriac epitome of Zacharias of Melitene. I know they're all later, but they're kind of some of the more meatier sources we have.
Yeah, but you get lots of interesting miscellany from, the Persian texts. Like a great set of letters is by the Bishop of Nisibis, Barsalmus. He's writing in the 460s, I think. And
nice.
He's writing about how the terror of living in Nisibis and thinking, well, basically he's dealing with issues like, the Monophysite faction in Nisibis wants to betray the city to the Romans. Then, actually, this is the 480s. If the Persian king gets word of this, then he's going to come for all of us because he's not going to distinguish between all these different Christian factions. Because most of the Christians in the Persian Empire are Nestorian. You have his letters describing, like, basically telling the bishop in Ctesiphon, who has seniority, telling him, you need to tell off this faction and make sure that they don't betray, that they know that we know what they're up to and that they back down.
Killed.
Yeah, exactly. And talking about how there's this Arabic group that is, because of a famine, has moved into the region and has looted Roman territory nearby. And basically the bishop of Ctesiphon is ordering this bishop, you need to come to Ctesiphon for this council. This could be a war. We need to try to diplomatically smooth this over. And so you do get great little documents like that. But unfortunately, of course, we don't have all our Sasanian texts, when they're not inscriptions, are later. And most of it really is preserved more so through Arabic texts than in the Persian original. Yeah.
That's why so many people study the, Ferdowsi.
Yes, and Al-Tabari. Yeah.
Exactly.
But it is the War of 440. I gotta say, it's such a, it's I think it's the ultimate example of what Peter Heather is getting at in his book on the barbarian invasions of the 5th century. He points out that because of the 3rd and 4th centuries, the Eastern Roman Empire has moved most of their forces into the Syrian and Mesopotamian provinces, because obviously in the 3rd and 4th century, the number one enemy is Persia. Because of Shapur the First and Shapur the Second have made that very clear that this is an opponent. Then you get to the 5th century, and it's this whole, suddenly everything has changed, and they're really, most of Eastern Roman resources, Heather's theory, and I presume he's using the Notitia Dignitatum, is that they are still, the majority of Eastern Roman forces are still in the East. Yet the most use they get in a war context is, the brief war of 421 to 422, and then this war in 440, as well as dealing with Arabic raiders. But 440, you need those soldiers in the Balkans. That is Attila is now attacking.
I was going to say, actually, I was just looking closer at what I'd written down, and the end of the last short war is Theodosius has to send his general to Yazdegerd II to call for basically a truce, because he has to go and fight the Goths or the Vandals or something like that. And then 10 years later, Yazdegerd's off fighting the Huns in the east. And the peace that the Romans and the Sassanids seem to come up with is very much, again, I think I mentioned it before, sort of a mutual defense pact, but it's not against each other, it's against the Huns.
Yeah.
Just as you have the regular Huns, if you like, invading the Roman Empire, you have the White Huns invading Persia, the Hephalites.
And these guys are also, I mean, it should be said, this is the strain of global history, these nomadic peoples moving in from the east. These are like the descendants of what the Chinese called the Xiongnu, who had been driven off the high plateaus by the expansion of the central Chinese state.
Sure, yeah. Going all back to the Eastern Han Dynasty, yeah. I mean, tying with your point about, they have to leave to deal with the Goths and the Vandals. I mean, it is it's such a stroke of luck on the one hand, Heather is right that the geopolitical situation has changed to a degree that it's sort of, in some ways, the Roman Empire is a bit wrong-footed by it, that the Eastern Roman Empire's resources are sort of in the wrong place. But on the other hand, how lucky they got. They got so lucky that Persia indeed was willing to get paid off in 440, because Attila starts sacking cities in the Balkans. Gaiseric captures Carthage around that time. The Vandals, the Goths, the Huns. This is really it is one of the. I think that's one of the reasons this period is so fascinating from the perspective of Roman-Persian relations. Is it was exactly what Rome needed to get through the 5th century. That it actually worked out this way.
Something to keep in mind is that in the 430s, both East and West are very busy trying to keep the Vandals out of Africa, and doing a very bad job of it. But also, Aetius, he was planning a major expedition to Africa with his main forces to push out the Vandals, and then cut it short because of the threat of the Huns. I can't remember exactly when that was, but I think just as much as the threat of the Huns was a boon for Persia and Rome to not fight each other, it also made things significantly more difficult for the West and the East, because the East had to tie up all of its forces fighting the Huns in the Balkans, which ended up being completely destroyed. The West hasn't got as many resources as the East, and it really needs to keep Africa, and just at the moment where it needs to commit all of its forces to doing that, the Huns show up, and they pose a threat to both Gaul and Italy.
Yeah, I think that's all around the same time, in fact. I think that this was, the idea was that Theodosius II and Aetius I mean, I'm going off memory, but yes, I think there was a plan to prevent Gaiseric from taking Carthage, but then Attila completely ruined it. And I think that's all the year 440. It's that point in time, I think.
And that will also explain why Theodosius is reluctant to give the Persians any money, because he needs his armies are expensive and he needs to equip as many armies and things.
As far as I can see, we'd also want to sort of put in the nuance here that Theodosius, as far as he was concerned, he was donating gold to build defenses in the Balkans and the Caucasus, whereas which the Persians sort of spun as to say, the Romans give us tribute, so we own Rome, kind of thing. Which can't have, if that got back to the Roman Emperor, that can't have pleased him either.
Yeah, especially because it's not entirely clear what the arrangement is, because we know from John the Lydian, who's writing in the 6th century, that there had been discussions about mutual defense since the 3rd quarter of the 4th century, that ever since Rome basically ceded most of Armenia to Shapur II, the talks began around the manning or funding of garrisons at the Derbent Pass and the various other Caspian gates, these entrances through the northern Caucasus. And no doubt the invasions that actually happened as early as 395 and 397 and 398 through those passes must have reinforced that this was an issue that needed to be taken seriously. And I suppose we can presume that there was a lot of mutual whatever was decided, there seemed to be a lot of mutual satisfaction in that early period with Yazdegerd I, when whatever they've decided, it seems to be working for them. But certainly framing payments as tribute, not going to go down well. And of course, Rome does the same thing whenever they get a gift from the Persians.
In some ways, as the beginning of the century, things are very hard for the Romans, starting in the east and then it shifts to the west. But as the century goes on, especially into the reign of Peroz I, things get very difficult for Persia, and whereas the Romans, or the west, ceases to exist, the east only has the Ostrogoths to deal with, who are not quite as threatening as the Huns were, although they have changes of dynasty, because after Marcian, the Theodosian dynasty ends, and then you have a smooth transition to the Leonids until the death of Leo II. Whereas Persia, it has these fits of instability, and then you have the whole Hephalite invasion with Peroz being defeated multiple times. Things start to shift in Rome's favour again.
Yeah, I think with the 480s till the end of the century, you see the seeds being sown for the 6th century, where suddenly war is the usual state of affairs again. And this ties in nicely with the payment requests, because Joshua the Stylite, he records in his chronicle, I think it's pseudo Joshua the Stylite. I think
so Joshua the Stylite is believed to have been the person who wrote the manuscript, but the source is based on a much earlier Syriac source who is unknown. So Joshua the Stylite is a real person, and the manuscript we have is his chronicle. The Joshua the Stylite Chronicle is this big book compiling multiple histories from yesteryear, because I think it also contains the Syriac epitome of Zacharias of Melitene, which also has its own Syriac continuation bolted onto it. So it's a weird mishmash of 5th and 6th century sources.
Oh, okay.
So Joshua wrote the manuscript, but he's using a much older Syriac source to provide the history for it. That, I believe, is the understanding.
Okay.
Of that.
Thanks for clarifying that,
Yeah.
because so I wasn't clear to me
The
what.
pseudo element is confusing because it's not someone pretending to be Joshua the Stylite. It is Joshua the Stylite, but using a much earlier source.
Sure. Okay. Yes, because that chronicle seems to be the best source we actually have for Peroz and his relations with the Romans, and really one of the best sources we have for his relations with the Hephthalites, because he tells us about how Peroz starts making. Actually, he also mentions that already under Yazdegerd II, there are these renewed requests for money to fight the Kidarites, who Peroz ends up conquering in league with the Hephthalites in the 460s. And this ends up creating a worse situation, because by conquering the Kidarites together with the Hephthalites, they actually empower the Hephthalites. And
the
Hephthalites, and their leader, they have this leader who we hear from, his name is only ever given in Persian sources, but they all seem to agree that there's this leader called Kushnawar or something along those lines, Akshanwar, Kushnawar. And he sort of seems to have been a bit of a military genius, really. Peroz starts making more requests for money from the Romans. He ends up getting captured by Kushnawar. Zeno, although the Romans frame this as a voluntary payment, because the Romans may well be expected to frame it that way, they pay his ransom. He is released. He then manages to get himself captured a second time. And finally, he marches against the Hephthalites for a third time and is defeated and killed. Famously, Kushnawar had disguised a bunch of trenches and ditches, and then the Persian cataphracts, together with the king, charged into the ditch and were butchered, or if they hadn't been, crushed by their own horses already.
Roll Canine and Dyke will be so happy.
Yeah, it's truly an insane event. And what that leads to really is, the Persian sources are very cagey about it, but actually there are various indications, including numismatic indications, that, as in coin evidence that the Persians are basically now actually properly paying tribute. They're having to pay reparations to the Hephthalites. The Hephthalites are treating it as tribute, and they are paying the Hephthalites so much money that the coins of Peroz that have been paid over to Kushnawar are finding their way into China. That we know from the research just how much coinage is actually flowing out of Persia into the Hephthalite Empire, and then from there across the Silk Road. And so, with that in mind, the Sassanids, by the end of the 5th century, are in a tight spot. They appear to have lost large chunks of their empire to the Hephthalites. They appear to have lost Bactria, Khorasan, Arachosia. And the king at the end of the century is Kava the First, who actually takes power. He's overthrown briefly, but he takes power for the second time, using Hephthalite forces, because he happens to be the son-in-law of Kushnawar. And what that really means is Kavar's not in a position to fight the Hephthalites. And so to get that money back, they need to request more money from the Romans. But the Romans, why would they pay money? As in fact, Emperor Zeno actually says in Joshua's Chronicle, he points out, well, why would he pay the Persians to strengthen their friendship with Huns? Why is that in Rome's interest to do that?
Yeah.
So
also, Zeno, the beginning of Anastasius' reign, the Eastern Roman Empire is still partially bankrupt from the Carthage expedition.
Yes, in 268, yeah. 468.
That takes an extraordinary amount of time to pay that back, and it remains in the a sort of bogeyman in the politics of the court of Constantinople right into Justinian's reign. We have John the Cappadocian being like, "Are you sure you want to waste all this money on invading the Vandals?"
Yeah, I mean, they can't be, yeah, exactly. They can't be that keen to just give money to the Persians, not not for the sake of mutual protection, but literally to just pay off reparations or tribute to the Hephthalites, certainly.